Well, I'm sure you remember the school shooting in Parkland, Florida, a few months ago, in which 17 students were killed and 17 injured. One of the unfortunate subplots of that terrible tragedy was the inadequate response of the school resource officer, Scott Peterson. As we just saw, the officer who was assigned by the local sheriff's office recognized that a deadly shooting was taking place, but opted not to enter the school to confront the killer as protocol required, saying later that he believed the killer was somewhere outside, although this contradicts official police transcripts. On top of that, local deputies stayed outside the building until 4 minutes after the shooter, Nicholas Cruz, had already escaped, and by the time they finally went inside, 34 people had been shot. Now, of course, it's easy to criticize law enforcement for shirking their duties. They put their lives on the line every day for us. And to be fair, the police actually found and arrested Cruz. But this only serves to reinforce the point that we need the law. We need the law and its enforcers. Bad things happen when the law isn't there to protect us. We might not always like the law. I mean, the law prevents us from sometimes doing what we would otherwise want to do, but we need the law. And this is actually the point in the passage from the Bible that we're going to study together this morning. The point is that as much as we might not always like God's law, we need God's law. We're studying Paul's letter to the Romans here at Rooftop in an extended study that's currently called The Struggle is Real, because this section of Romans is all about our ongoing struggle with sin in our lives. If you're just joining us or you don't know much about the book of Romans, Romans is a big, important letter in the New Testament. It was written by a guy named Paul. Paul was a first century Christian missionary and an eyewitness of the resurrected Christ. He, in his travels, really wanted to visit the Christian church in the capital city of Rome. So he wrote them a nice long letter introducing himself, "Hi, I'm Paul," and summarizing for them the message of Christianity that he wanted to come preach to them upon his arrival. The message that, even though we are all terrible sinners, God still loves us and came to earth as a man to die for our sins and pay the penalty that we owe God, satisfying his wrath. That's the message of Christianity and the message of Romans. Now, we've been walking our way very, very slowly through Romans, taking it passage by passage, and appropriately enough, this morning I want to look at the next one. It has a lot to say about the necessity and the importance of God's law in our lives. So let me read to you Romans chapter 7, verses 7 through 13. What shall we say then? Is the law sinful? Certainly not. Nevertheless, I would not have known what sin was had it not been for the law. For I would not have known what coveting really was if the law had not said, "You shall not covet." But sin, seizing the opportunity afforded me by the commandment, produced in me every kind of coveting. For apart from the law, sin was dead. Once I was alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin sprang to life, and I died. I found that the very commandment that was intended to bring life actually brought death. For sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, deceived me, and through the commandment put me to death. So then, the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, righteous, and good. Did that which is good then become death to me? By no means. Nevertheless, in order that sin might be recognized as sin, it used what is good to bring about my death, so that through the commandment, sin might become utterly sinful. Now, I will tell you, that's a doozy of a passage. There's a lot going on in there. You might be like, but our goal this morning is to kind of figure out what's happening in the passage, and more importantly, what God, through Paul, wants to say to you and I. But in order to figure out what's actually happening in the passage, we got to kind of put it back in the context of what Paul is generally saying in the book of Romans as a whole. As we've been talking about, one of the things that you got to remember when reading the Bible in general, but Romans in particular, is that a large majority of Paul's audience was Jewish, right. Paul himself was a Jew. And Jews were typically referred to as people of the law. A lot of Jews believed that they were God's special chosen people because God had given them the Old Testament law. The Old Testament is that portion of the Bible before the life of Jesus. And the Old Testament law includes a whole bunch of do's and don'ts that a lot of Jews believed if they kept the law, they would be able to sort of prove themselves in God's sight. They would be able to basically earn their way into God's righteousness. Now, the law of God includes all different kinds of laws. It includes, the big 10 commandments. Maybe you're familiar with the 10 commandments. Don't make idols, worship God only, don't murder, honor the Sabbath, honor your father and mother, 10 commandments. But it also includes other kinds of laws and other books of the Old Testament, like laws on how to worship, what type of sacrifices to make, when and where, how to eat, how to interact with people, how to treat your body, like how to get circumcised. So lots of laws, and many Jews in the first century really believed that the better they did at obeying the law, the better they could be with God. Now, Paul's whole point in Romans, one of his whole points, is that the law never had that kind of power. Nobody could be made right in God's eyes by obeying the law. Being made righteous in God's eyes is a matter of accepting what God's Son did on the cross in dying for our disobedience to the law. We can't be saved by obeying the law. We're not that obedient. And the law is too hard. We can only be saved by accepting Christ's sacrifice on the cross for our disobedience to the law. That's Paul's point. Now, as you can imagine, this idea that we are saved not by obeying the law, but by receiving the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, that idea would have really challenged and perplexed and frankly irritated Paul's Jewish audience. They had spent their entire lives, a lot of them had spent their entire lives working really hard to obey the law. And now Paul comes along and says, it's not how it works. You got to accept Jesus dead on the cross for your disobedience. And that left them asking a very important question. What do we do with the law then? What do we do with the law? Do we obey it anyway? Do we double down on the law? Do we kind of toss it? Do we throw it out the window? What do we do with the law? That was a big question for Jews in the first century. And frankly, it's a big question for us too. As we talked about last week, even though most of us here aren't Jewish, we all have our laws. We all have our rules, even religious ones. We all have our moral codes. Anytime that we think God has something that we must do, that's kind of a religious rule. We got to do it. I mean, even though a lot of us here are Christians, not necessarily Jews, and a lot of the, ritualistic laws in here don't necessarily pertain to us, we still have a lot to do in Scripture. A lot of do's, a lot of don'ts, a lot of do this, a lot of do that. To be religious usually means having rules to obey. Now, some of us like this. Some of us are rule keepers. Any rule keepers here this morning? Raise your hand high. I'm telling you to raise your hand high. Rule keeper. Get it? Rule keeper. Yeah. A lot of us don't like rules, though. We're rule breakers. Any rule breakers here this morning? Right, yeah. I might raise my hand for you. Yeah, a lot of us respond to the law one way or the other. In fact, on the matter of rules and religion, I think we tend to respond in one of two ways. This might actually take us a bit afield from our passage in Romans this morning, but I promise we'll get back to it, and I actually think this will be beneficial for us. When it comes to the matter of rules and religion, we usually make one of two decisions. We move in one of two directions. We make one of two mistakes. We slide in one of two directions. We slide in the direction of libertinism or legalism. We slide in the direction of libertinism or legalism. Now, I know those are two big words, so let me tell you what I'm talking about. Libertinism, for example, is the idea that because Jesus died to forgive us of our sins, there are no rules. We have been liberated from the law. Every sin we could commit can be forgiven by God, so we might as well live it up. This is libertinism. We might call it hippie Christianity. Jesus died for your sins and freed you from having to obey religious rules, so kick back, smoke a joint, and have a margarita. Do whatever you want, divorce your spouse, waste your money, skip church, God forgives, no rules. That's libertinism. The other mistake we make with respect to our rules is legalism. Legalism is the belief that, yeah, Jesus might have died to forgive us of our sins, but we still have obligations to maintain, and lots of them. And unless we maintain those obligations, God won't forgive us. If we were to call libertinism as hippie Christianity, we might call legalism angry fundamentalism. Angry fundamentalists believe that, sure, God forgives sin, but that's only because sin is really bad for you, and you have to stop sinning no matter what, otherwise God might not have actually forgiven you. That's libertinism and legalism. And they are both mistakes with regard to the law. That's what I want to say. These are mistakes we make. And what's unfortunate is that they're both consequential mistakes. I mean, the consequences of libertinism, for example, are sin and moral compromise. You just kind of keep sinning and compromising whatever sort of moral example you would want to make for the world. That's the consequences of libertinism. And the consequences of legalism are many, but anxiety, gotta keep the law, gotta keep the law, gotta keep the law, and judgmentalism. Because if you have any success at keeping the law, then you can judge other people who don't. Those are both bad. In fact, if you want something interesting to think about or talk about on your way home with your spouse or talk about in your small group this week, here's a good question. Am I more of a libertine or a legalist? Am I more of a hippie Christian or am I more of an angry fundamentalist? I actually believe each of us have a tendency to slide in one of those two directions based on our personality, our religious background, our personal heroes. And I think it's worth asking what our tendency is. I, for example, slide in more of a legalistic direction. You might be surprised to hear that with my backwards hat and my no-rules personality. But here's the secret about Pastor Matt. It's a cover. It's a cover for my legalism. My tendency is as a rule keeper who believes, anxiously so, that God will like me more if I obey the rules. Being a rule keeper also allows me to judge others for not keeping the rules as well as I do, and I've confessed to you, I like judging others. So the advantage of being very good at rule keeping allows me to judge others. Now, I'm not proud of that. It's a confession. It's just my tendency. That's my tendency. Don't judge me for it, because you have yours too. What's your tendency? Are you a libertine or a legalist, a hippie Christian or an angry fundamentalist? And far more importantly, do you recognize how it affects your life? How it leads you into greater sin, moral compromise, or greater anxiety and judgmentalism? Now, I mention all this because throughout Romans, we can see Paul walking a fine line. He has been preaching the gospel of God's forgiveness for sin to law-abiding Jews, but he's aware that on hearing this, his audience might make one of these two mistakes and think that God's forgiveness must mean they can sin all they want or they must never sin ever again. They might slide into libertinism or legalism. Neither of those are healthy, so Paul tries to steer his audience away from these mistakes and towards the healthy middle. Now, question, what's the healthy middle? I really wish I had an L word here to alliterate with libertinism and legalism. But for the life of me, I don't. I scoured the L section of the thesaurus looking for a word that would fit, an L word that would fit. The English language has failed us once again. So we're just going to call the middle way the gospel. It's got an L in there, so the gospel. I thought after the first service, here's another option. We'd call it the middle way, le gospel. Le gospel. I think it works. Is it? Chris likes it. Yeah. The middle way is le gospel. The gospel, here's what the gospel is. The gospel is humble obedience to God's law as a grateful response to his forgiveness of our disobedience, made possible by the sacrifice of Christ. That's le gospel. Humble obedience to God's law is a grateful response to his forgiveness of our disobedience, made possible by the sacrifice of Christ. We don't need to obey the law perfectly in order to be accepted by God. That's legalism. God already accepts us. But just because God accepts us doesn't mean we're free from the law, which is libertinism. No, we don't have to obey the law perfectly, but that doesn't mean the law has no value. The law has lots of value. The law might not be able to help us earn our place before God, but that doesn't mean we should chuck it. Which finally, praise Jesus, brings us back to our passage in Romans. Here in Romans 7, Paul explains that yes, to be sure, Jesus died to release the Jews from their law. They were freed from the belief that by obeying the law, they could achieve righteousness in God's eyes. Only Jesus can get us into heaven. But that doesn't make the law worthless. The law has value, as we learned in Parkland, as we learned here in St. Louis time and time and time again. The law has value. We need the law. We need God's law. Theologians have actually pointed out over the years that even for Christians, the law of God does a lot of very important things. The law of God reveals God's righteousness. The law reveals God's will. The law holds our religious communities together. And most importantly, here in this passage, here's what the law does. As Paul says, the law exposes sin in our lives and directs us to God's mercy and grace. The law reveals us as sinners. As Paul says here, I would not have known what sin was if it had not been for the law. Without the law, we wouldn't know what sinners we are, and whether or not we know it, it's really important that we know that. And on this point, Paul gives us an illustration. He quotes the 10th commandment. Remember the 10 commandments that we talked about earlier in the book of Exodus? The 10th commandment is the law against coveting. Thou shalt not covet. Now, maybe you don't know what coveting is. Coveting is basically to lust after things that don't belong to you, whether it's houses, spouses, goods, whatever. Don't do that. The problem with coveting is that it poisons our relationships with others. It kind of roots them in jealousy. And also it distracts us, coveting distracts us from the goodness and the generosity of God in our own lives. That's why the law says, do not covet. And about coveting, Paul writes this. He says, for I would not have known what coveting really was if the law had not said, you shall not covet. But sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, produced in me every kind of coveting. For apart from the law, sin was dead. Once I was alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin sprang to life and I died. Now, I know that's kind of confusing, so let me go ahead and explain what Paul is saying. What Paul is saying is that sin lies dead or dormant within him. Sin lies dormant in all of us. We are all sinners deep on the inside. We all have a deeply hidden tendency to disobey God and each other. That's a problem. Sin is like a sleeping beast lying inside of us in its cave. Now, the commands of God, the law, awaken sin. The law draws sin out. As soon as we see the command not to covet, what do we find ourselves really wanting to do? Covet. That's sin. We are the sort of people who break laws. That's one of the values of the law, and that exposes us as the sinners we really are on the inside. The law draws the sin out of the woods. Let me give you a somewhat goofy illustration of this, followed by a very serious illustration of this. Goofy illustration first. I have a friend here at Rooftop, former elder. His name is Nick Spinolas. Maybe you know Nick Spinolas. You might hear him on Joy FM in the morning. One of the fun things that Nick likes to do is he likes to take pictures of himself breaking rules. I don't know if you're excited to hear about a Joy FM DJ who likes taking pictures of himself breaking rules. But here's some, and then he posts them on Facebook to show the Christian Joy FM community what a lawbreaker he is. Here's some pictures of Nick flaunting rules. He actually does that here at Rooftop too. He puts it, go ahead to the next slide. He puts his coffee up on the ledge. If you're ever up in the balcony, we have clearly marked signage saying, do not put your coffee up on the ledge, and then he's up there just putting his coffee. So I don't know if he's up there right now, or I don't know if you guys want to move in case the coffee comes toppling over the ledge. So Nick sees the rules and thinks, oh, I must break that. That's the way he does. Goofy illustration. Let me show you a more serious illustration. There's a very famous illustration of this by a well-known Christian theologian named Augustine. Augustine was a 4th century Roman who was a bit of a rebel in his youth before he became a Christian. In his well-known book, Confessions, Augustine recounts a time that he and some friends went out for a night of mayhem. They got it in their minds to steal a bunch of pears from a neighbor farmer's pear tree. And what's really interesting about this incident is the way Augustine thinks about it and interprets it years later. Here's how he describes it in his book, Confessions. We set out late at night and stole all the fruit we could carry. And this was not to feed ourselves. We may have tasted a few, but then we threw the rest to the pigs. Our real pleasure was simply in doing something that was not allowed. I had plenty of better pears of my own. I only took these ones in order that I might be a thief. Once I had taken them, I threw them away, and all I tasted in them was my own iniquity, which I enjoyed very much. As he goes on, could I enjoy what was forbidden for no other reason except that it was forbidden? Augustine stole the pears because he enjoyed breaking the law. The law drew out his iniquity. Hearing that he shouldn't steal pears made him want to steal pears. Now, like Augustine, like Nick Spinolis, we all know that feeling of wanting to do something just because it's wrong. We violate the speed limit because we're not going to let the law tell us how fast we can drive. We disobey our parents' rules on curfew just to tick them off. We say rude things to our spouse just for the heck of it. That's one of the things our laws do. They turn us into sinners. Now, that sort of raises the question, well, then, if the law turns us into sinners, then could God have just kind of avoided this whole situation by not giving us the law in the first place? If it's the law that turns us into sinners, why did God have to give us the law? Can he just kind of let us live our lives? But that's not Paul's point. It's not the law that's the problem. It's sin that's the problem, and sin is inside of us, and the law draws sin out. As Paul has said in the book of Romans, the law is holy, righteous, and good. The law exposes us for who we are. The law is like bait laid out in front of the dragon's lair, which draws out the head of the beast. The beast was there the whole time. It was just sleeping. As Paul writes in verse 13, the law was given in order that sin might be recognized as sin. It was through the commandment that sin might become utterly sinful. So the law is not a bad thing. This is not a bad thing for sin to be recognized as utterly sinful in our lives. Why not? Because it's who we are. We are utterly disobedient lawbreakers. The law exposes us as the utterly sinful, contemptible lawbreakers that we are. Now, for what purpose? Why did God give us the law to expose our sin? Just so we could walk around feeling bad about ourselves? Is that what God's real interest is here? I want to make them feel really bad about themselves. So I'm going to give them the law so they know how terrible they are. No, that's not Paul's point. And this gets us to Paul's real point here, the thing he really wants us to understand. God doesn't give us the law to reveal us as sinners so that we might walk around as condemned criminals. Paul's point is that God gives us the law so that we might experience his mercy and grace in removing the burden of our guilt. God uses the law to draw the beast of our sin out of the cave so we can chop off its head with the sword of his grace. Yes, God is holy and righteous and just. He hates sin. But God is also kind and generous and eager to forgive us. He came to earth as a man to die on a cross so that we could be forgiven, but he really wants to forgive every part of us. He wants to forgive us as the utterly contemptible sinners we are, not as the slightly bad people we think we might be. He wants to forgive us as the utterly contemptible, law-breaking sinners we are, not as the, people who make a few mistakes every now and then. So he gave us the law. Take as one final example the two greatest commandments. Maybe you know the two greatest commandments. Like we've established, ancient Jews, they had a lot of laws. There's a lot of laws in here, a lot of things to obey. And frankly, too many things to remember to obey. And so one of the arguments that ancient Jews like to have within each other is, of all the commands here, of all the laws, what's the most important? It's one of the things they like to debate. What's the most important law in here? They actually, at one point in Jesus' ministry, looped him in on the debate. And they asked him, "Teacher, what do you think? What do you think the most important law is?" Now, maybe you know what Jesus' answer was. Jesus was quite familiar with the law, being its author, so he decides to quote it verbatim. And as Matthew records in the gospel, Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment." That's from the book of Deuteronomy. "And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." That's from the book of Leviticus. "All the law, all the prophets hang on these two commandments." So these are the two most important commandments in the entire Bible. Love God completely, love your neighbor as yourself. Everything else in the Bible is based on those two commands. Now, Christians like to hold on to this passage. Christians like to hold on to these rules as sort of a simple way to remember how to follow Jesus, right? There's lots of things in the Bible that you got to do, but really if it all boils down to something, it boils down to these two rules: love God completely, love your neighbor as yourself. You might forget everything else in the Bible, but just hold on to those two rules and you won't get confused. And with some justification. I mean, that's really what Jesus is saying. Just remember these two things. Everything else kind of hinges on that. But here's the thing to remember. It's not like those two commands are easy. They're harder than anything. I mean, Jesus reduces the law to two things, like the two most impossible things to do. We fail at them time and time again. I mean, the most important rule in the universe is to love God completely with our heart, mind, and soul. Another version of this story in another gospel, Jesus throws in body and strength. So love God with your heart, soul, spirit, mind, body, and strength. Okay. Like with every part of who I am? That's not easy. I can barely love God with a small portion of my heart, maybe a little bit of my mind. Sometimes my body loves God while my mind is elsewhere. Sometimes my soul is worshiping God while my body is flagrantly ignoring his commands. My love for God is never perfectly complete. And Jesus says to love others like ourselves, but we fail there too. Every day we fail there. I mean, to love other people as yourself means to treat them as you want to be treated, right? This week, I have dropped that ball countless times. I've been a grump to my children. I've let my schedule relegate my wife to the back seat. I have honked unnecessarily at other drivers. I actually yelled at a stranger in the Galleria parking lot last night. I thought mean things about other people. I paid more attention to certain people based on their looks and utility to me. I have not given people the benefit of the doubt. Is that how I want to be treated? No, but I treat people like that all the time. Don't judge me, you do too. We all do. Sometimes we even do it, like Augustine, like Nick, just because we know it's wrong. That's what sinners like us do. We disobey God because we know it's wrong. No, these two commandments aren't easy. Jesus didn't give them to us because they're easy. They're the hardest rules in the Bible, but that's the point. The law is hard, even impossible, so that it may reveal to us that we need God. We need his mercy. We need his grace. We need the law because it lets us know that we need God more. Even as the law exposes us as utterly sinful, the gospel reminds us that God forgives utterly sinful people like us. As Paul has already said in Romans, the law was brought in so that the trespass might increase. The law makes us bigger trespassers. But where sin increased, grace increased more. So do you know how utterly sinful you are before God? Have you been exposed as a lawbreaker? You are one in a major way. You don't even know the half of it. I don't even know the half of it. The law, though, is God's gift to us to expose us for the sinners we really are, but also as an opportunity for us to hear the truth, that even as utterly contemptible sinners we are, we must be forgiven. We can be forgiven by the sacrifice of Jesus, who died so that we could be forgiven of every inch of our contemptibleness. And if we are forgiven, we have nothing to look forward to but a life of joy and peace as we enjoy God's presence forever in the new heavens and the new earth. Jesus died not so we might live lives of insufferable legalism. Jesus died not so we might live lives of compromising libertinism. Jesus died so that we might be able to experience le gospel. He died so we might live lives of love, humbly obedient to the law of God, depending on his grace for when we fail, as we do, as we will, time and time again. Maybe you're here this morning as a failure, and you know that whatever God has given you to do, you haven't been able to do it. Well, that's the promise of the gospel. God forgives that. Maybe you're here this morning as a legalist, and you think you're doing a pretty good job at keeping the law. Hear me very clearly. You're not. You're not. That's a lie foisted upon you by the devil. We're all lawbreakers. Worse lawbreakers than we can ever imagine. But that's why Jesus came to preach the gospel, so that we could be forgiven of our sin and enjoy our status as God's children with a bright and eternal future.